Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture on reading scholarly literature. So you just gathered a whole lot of articles to sift through for your review, and now you're here with a list of sources ready to dive in. Today we're going to talk through what that process might look like for you. This is another one of those procedures that might take different forms depending on your particular strategies for reading and retaining information. So I'll give you a few different ways you might read through your literature, and then you can kind of decide what's best for you. So I'm going to begin with two very short, pretty easy, and yet integral tips for reading your scholarly sources. The first tip I have for you is to understand the genre of the scholarly article and use its typical structure to help you read. We talked this week about how there are certain conventions within scholarly knowledge production that cue reviewers, journals, readers, and peers into knowing that this is a scientist. One of those conventions is the format of a scholarly article, and you can use it to your advantage. One of those, I'll break that down in the following slide. The second is a reading strategy called active reading. I'm sure you've heard this term before and probably have practiced it in your college career, but I want to break down what that means for scholarly research in particular in the next slides as well. So let's first break down the scholarly article. I already suggested in the previous lecture that reading abstracts is a great way of getting the overall picture of a scholarly article. In fact, the abstract follows the following structure, typically. An introduction to the topic, a statement about the foundational literature for the study, a statement on the methods used, a short synopsis of the findings, and the conclusions that the author wants the reader to take away. That's the structure of an article, so you can already get a sense for what's happening just by reading the abstract. Headings for the article will also give you an indication of the structure for the article. When I'm reading, sometimes I'll write down the headings on a separate page to be able to visualize the structure without all the details bogging it down. You can also usually find main ideas or arguments in the first sentences of a paragraph, so this can also help you get a sense for the major moves the article is taking. Whereas data is going to be the nitty-gritty of the findings, the conclusions are going to be what articulates the implications and significance of the study. Thinking about the role that each of these pieces play in the structure of the journal article is going to help you read actively and strategically. And that structure is going to help you read actively, which really just means reading with purpose. Some reading strategies that I've found are most effective are the following. The first, to read the article 3 times. You may be thinking to yourself, I can't reasonably read a dense 20, 30-page article 3 times. That's insane. And it is. That's why your 3 reads are going to look very different. The first is to read for the takeaways. Read the introduction to find the "in this article we find" statement. That's your main argument. Now, skip everything and go to the conclusion or the discussion section. And I really do mean this. Skip it all and go straight to the conclusion. Identify the major findings from that conclusion. And finally, go back to the middle of the paper, look at the headings and topic sentences to figure out the major moves the article is making to reach those findings, and that is it. That's the first read. So the second read is to go back to each section and look for details. What specific information makes this article meet up in interesting ways against others? Look at the methods, the data figures, other details that give you a more intimate understanding of how this article makes its argument. Now your final read is a skim. You've got the major ideas, you have a sense of the details. Now you just want to read it all in one go so that you can understand the article as a cohesive whole. Again, this is a strategy for reading that assumes you have a very specific purpose: to figure out this article's findings and how they reach them. As you read, you might want to think about summarizing sections, especially for very dense articles that are difficult to parse. Similarly, you want to read to understand, which means making notes, jotting down ideas and questions, no matter how small they are. Put hearts and stars next to things that you feel are important. Highlight text that you think you might be able to quote. Find a system of physically engaging with the text, of dialoguing with the text. And with that, there are also many ways you can actively read that creates a conversation between you and the article. This is this "they say, I say" bullet that I've got here. One example of this is what we in writing studies call a double entry journal. Many of you might have encountered this in literature courses, but basically under one column you write key data or passages that strike you, and next to it in another column you write your response to that data or that passage. You do this as you read, so that you're having an ongoing dialogue with the article's main ideas. And finally, I would highly, highly suggest for a literature review creating some kind of tagging system for reading through your articles. Make notes on other articles that you've read that relate to this one. Create labels that indicate this set of articles is related to a single idea. Creating metadata around your articles will allow you to see the connections between them much clearer later on. And after all, the connections are going to be the content of your literature review. So you might want to incorporate a strategy for synthesis into your reading before you start writing. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you a few examples of the strategies that I've talked about. The first here is in-text annotating, writing on the text as you go. You can see here an article I annotated on locative mobile media. It's not complicated, not overly written on or highlighted. I simply noted things that I felt were important, identified ideas that resonated with me with some hearts, and asked a question of the text in the margin, and that's it. This next strategy is the process of summarizing as you go. This might look like inline annotations, jotting down summarizing notes in the margins of each section, but you might also just write a summary after each reading. I've included a screenshot of one of my own comprehensive exam readings. This program you see here is a program called Zotero. It's free. It's a literature management system that I found really helpful throughout my research career. With it, you can add in citation information, and that is here. And you can also use tags to help organize information around your readings. So that's here. You can see I have Minahan and Cox's article on Stitch and Bitch communities, my summary here, and a few tags for related readings. This is technofeminism, as well as content tags. So these are ideas that I have seen come up in several different articles. Third spacecraft, cyberfeminism, nostalgia, technoscience. So anytime in Zotero, it's really cool because anytime I click on that tag, it takes me to all of the articles that I've tagged as technoscience. So the final example I have is actually not one of my own, but from one of ECU's English Education Literacy modules. You can see the passage on the left under text and several responses from the reader under response. On the right, these responses focus mostly around the credibility of the text, which is fine, but the first response is also almost a cue to self that says that this is a claim that the reader needs to be looking for evidence for, and what evidence is this information based. Other ways of using a double entry journal are to ask questions, identify gaps and limitations, and draw connections to other readings. So you've started reading. So I want to come back to this idea of recursivity in research, and it's going to keep coming back. It's going to be tempting to make conclusions about the research after just a few articles, a few read-throughs. But remember, this research should shape what you know. It should cause you to go back to those search terms and research more. It should prompt you to follow new pathways. An article might be so compelling that you drop to the bibliography almost immediately, find 8 new articles that you go, and research again. This is just a reminder that you should spend some time with the literature before you start to make decisions about what it says. While you read with the purpose of understanding the literature and identifying connections between them, you may still be wondering how you might start identifying the points of agreement and disagreement in the text you read. In other words, how you might actually start to draft this literature review. I'm going to suggest a single method for doing this, though you may find that you've already started identifying trends through your active reading strategies that we just went over. This strategy, though, is called a source grid, and it lists the studies along the left-hand side, right here, and it lists specific topics or main arguments across the top. What these columns should be titled will depend on the research you've done. It might be like research questions, methods, principal results, etc. It also might be specific ideas that pop up in each article, like conditions associated with C. pylori, or in the example here, writing center compromises. The source grid will then help you notice clusters or subgroups of studies that could usefully be discussed together in your review. It may also help you identify subheadings for review, which is super helpful. Be especially aware of how findings are consistent across a set of studies, how studies might occur in different contexts or under different conditions, and where there is a consensus in the field versus when there are different interpretations. Now, you got all this information, what to do with it? Well, let's say this first. You've done a lot already. You've compiled research, you've accommodated it within your own and existing frameworks, you've revised your understanding of the topic based on new information. If I were to go through the actual cognitive processes associated with researching and using scholarly literature, you'd actually be about 3/4 of the way there at this point before ever starting your draft. That's simply to say that reading literature for a literature review takes significantly more effort and time than actually drafting the review will. In the next few slides, I'm going to quickly run through the ways that you can think about writing the review, but keep this in mind. You've done a lot of this work already. So like any document you might write, a review generally has a beginning, middle, and end. The beginning of a literature review is its introduction. The introduction should introduce the topic and establish its significance. This can be done in a number of ways, but you'll generally see that scholars indicate the larger body of ideas and then narrow down to why this particular topic is of importance. You'll also want to give your readers a preview of the major trends and topics that have emerged from the literature and that you're going to cover in the review. You could say that this is actually the thesis of a literature review, though the genre typically does not offer arguments or new findings. It's simply conclusions about the body of literature. So the middle of the review is already work that you've been doing. Remember I said that 75% of a literature review is completed during the reading stage? Well, the body of the review is where you will organize those clusters you identified during reading. Make sure to use headings when necessary, especially if a specific section covers a complex array of topics. If a section goes on for more than a page, double-spaced, it might be an indicator to see if there is more than one idea that can be parsed out under separate headings there. Also, be sure to use topic sentences to highlight the ways that ideas, articles, and groups of researchers are relating to one another. You're going to be expected to organize this review around topics rather than individual sources. So be sure you're transitioning between ideas and not studies, and you're doing it appropriately. And finally, your conclusion will just go back over what is known about the topic, essentially what you've covered in your review. It's also going to be an opportunity to identify what is left to explore, what needs to be known. Embedded within a larger journal article, this literature review will end with a gap in scholarship that needs to be filled, and presumably will be filled by the present study. For now, identify that gap. What is still known that needs further research? So a quick note about using sources in your literature review. There are generally two ways to use your sources, summarizing and quoting. Summary comes in two forms. Summary, of its own accord, which is to reduce a larger piece of literature into its most basic points. You may have done this while reading your sources. A paraphrase, on the other hand, is rewriting information in your own words. The difference is an issue of distillation. Summary condenses, paraphrase simply rewrites. Now, quotation is probably familiar to you, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of quotation in literature reviews. Generally, quotations aren't a part of the literature review unless absolutely necessary. Because you're drawing connections and synthesizing ideas, you want to be able to put these ideas into your own words through summary and paraphrase. A rule I like to live by, which is up here in the corner, is to quote for language and paraphrase or summarize for ideas. If your goal is to review the major ideas of the field, then it would follow that you want to paraphrase and summarize more than you want to quote. If you're choosing to summarize and paraphrase, be wary of a phenomenon we call patch writing, which is this last bullet here. This is cutting and pasting fragments or small sections of a passage and piecing them together with your own words, kind of stuck in the middle there. A lot of times patch writes will mimic the structure of a source text and simply replace words with their synonyms. That is not paraphrase, but it's actually a form of plagiarism. Unfortunately, it's pretty rampant in academic writing, so you'll likely see it in some of your articles. However, I will be looking for you to truly rewrite the ideas of your source text into your own words. And in fact, you should find this easy if you are intent on synthesizing ideas rather than simply recapitulating what has been said. However you choose to use your source text, you're going to need to make sure citation is one of your priorities. So I've asked you in this assignment to find the citation guidelines for one of the top journals in your field and use that style for using sources. However, generally these guidelines are going to follow one of three systems that have been identified by the Council of Science Editors. The first is called name year, the second is citation sequence, and then finally citation name. Name year is what I use in this course, also known as APA, the author's last name and the date of publication in parentheses. In the list of references at the end, sources are listed by alphabetical order. For both citation sequence and citation name, the in-text citation is the number of the reference from the reference list. The reference list is ordered alphabetically for citation name, but for citation sequence, the list is numbered based on when the source is mentioned in the text. For example, the first source cited will be number 1 on the reference list, the second number 2, and so on. For citation name, an author named Alan would be number 1, whereas an author named Zara would be number 15. I want to end with some things to remember about writing, about research. You can probably look right at this slide and see that all of the bullet points here are don't statements, and I don't mean to be so negative, but where these ethical considerations come from is a long history of reviewers not doing the right things in representing research. Remember that your goal here is to represent the state of the field in accurate, unbiased, logical ways. You aren't trying to trick your audience. You aren't trying to persuade your audience to take any action other than to understand the connections between these studies. So with that, don't use false, misrepresented, distorted, or irrelevant evidence. Don't intentionally use unsupported or illogical reasoning. Don't link claims that aren't actually related, and don't ask your audience to either. Don't misrepresent or distort the consequences of a study. Don't oversimplify things. Take the time to explain their complexity. You have the time to do it. Do it. And don't pretend that there's certainty when there isn't. In fact, where there isn't certainty is actually where your literature review can have an important impact on the field by identifying what needs to be looked at further because it isn't certain. And with that, you can reasonably go forth and write up a first draft of your literature review. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about peer review as a process for this class, as well as a process for validating scholarly literature. I'll see you then.